William Wallace, hanged, drawn, and quartered, 1305. When people think of rebellion, they think of freedom. But in medieval England, the price of that word was agony. William Wallace, a minor Scottish noble, led uprisings against English rule after his homeland was annexed by King Edward I. His victories at Stirling Bridge made him a legend. His capture years later made him a target. In August 1305, he was dragged through the streets of London, crowned with mock garlands and charged with treason, a word that cut deep because Wallace had never sworn loyalty to England. The verdict was certain. He was hanged until half dead, cut down alive, disemboweled, and his body divided into 4 parts. His head was spiked on London Bridge as a warning, each limb sent to a different Scottish town. To Edward, it was justice. To Scotland, it was martyrdom. Within a decade, Robert the Bruce carried Wallace's banner to independence. The English king tried to terrorize a nation with one execution, but instead he gave it a symbol that would never die.
Girolamo Savonarola, hanged and burned in Florence in 1498. At the end of the 15th century, Florence called itself the most cultured city in Europe. Into that luxury walked Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar armed with scripture, rage, and a vision of moral fire. He preached against corruption, vanity, and even the Medici family, declaring that Florence must become a new Jerusalem. When Charles VIII of France invaded Italy in 1494, Savonarola called it divine punishment. Amazingly, he became Florence's de facto leader. Under his rule, gambling, art, and jewelry were burned in the infamous bonfire of the vanities. But power makes enemies. When famine and fear followed his Puritan reforms, the church accused him of heresy and political disobedience. On May 23, 1498, in the city's Piazza della Signoria, the preacher was stripped of his robes, hanged, then burned alongside 2 followers, the same square where he'd once condemned sin. His ashes were scattered into the Arno to prevent worship. The republic he dreamed of lasted barely a month. Yet centuries later, Florence still remembers him as the monk who tried to build heaven and died for forgetting how human power works.
Guy Fawkes, remember the 5th of November, 1606. On a cold night in 1605, London slept above a ticking bomb, 36 barrels of gunpowder hidden beneath the Houses of Parliament. The man charged with lighting it was a soldier named Guy Fawkes, part of a Catholic group determined to kill King James I and ignite revolution. The plot unraveled when an anonymous letter warned a noble to stay away from the session. Guards stormed the cellars in the early hours of November 5th and found Fawkes with a fuse and a lantern. Under torture, he revealed his accomplices. A trial for high treason followed, and the sentence was England's most terrifying: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Fawkes cheated part of that fate by jumping from the scaffold, breaking his neck. Still, his body was quartered and displayed as a lesson in loyalty. Instead of inspiring fear, his failure became legend. Each November 5th, Britain still burns Guy effigies on bonfires to remember the night faith and fanaticism nearly blew an empire apart.
Anne Boleyn, the queen who lost her crown and her head, 1536. Anne Boleyn entered England's royal court as an ambitious young noblewoman and left it as the most talked-about queen in history. She caught the eye of King Henry VIII and helped trigger England's break with the Catholic Church. For Henry, she was the love that justified defying the Pope. For England, she symbolized an emerging new faith. But when she failed to deliver a male heir and her sharp intelligence began to threaten the men around her, her power turned dangerous. Whispers became accusations. Adultery, witchcraft, even incest. Her trial was theater. Her guilt predetermined. On May 19, 1536, a French executioner was imported for a merciful beheading by sword within the Tower of London. Anne knelt calmly and said, "Jesu, receive my soul."
Henry was married again within 11 days. Yet Anne's daughter, Elizabeth I, later ruled longer and more brilliantly than any Tudor. The queen meant to be erased became immortal through her child and the church she helped create.
Giles Corey, pressed to death at Salem, 1692. During the Salem witch trials, panic and religion blurred into madness. Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer, was accused of witchcraft after his wife Martha was arrested. He refused to enter a plea, an act that blocked the court from confiscating his family land. For 2 days in September 1692, authorities laid heavy stones on his chest, demanding he speak. Each time they asked, he gasped back the same words, "More weight." By the 3rd day, he was dead without a trial. The trial records show his silence changed public opinion. The executions ended weeks later. His defiance made him the only American ever executed by pressing and turned the shortest word spoken in Salem into a centuries-long rebuke to fear.
Robert-François Damiens, the last man drawn and quartered in France, 1757. In January 1757, a common servant named Robert-François Damiens lunged at King Louis XV with a penknife outside Versailles. The wound barely broke skin, but striking a monarch was the ultimate crime: regicide. His sentence? France's most spectacular execution. Hundreds thronged Paris's Place de Grève as officials tore his skin with red-hot pincers, poured boiling lead into the wounds, and tethered his arms and legs to 4 horses. When they failed to pull him apart, executioners used knives. The ordeal lasted hours. To the crown it was justice. To the crowd, a horror they never forgot. Writers like Voltaire and later Foucault cited it as proof that old regimes ruled by terror, not law. Damiens tried to kill one king, and instead helped kill the idea of absolute kingship itself. Mary, Queen of Scots, The Crown and the Axe, 1587. Mary Stuart was born a queen and doomed by crown politics. Ascending the Scottish throne at 6 days old, married into France's royalty and half English by blood, she stood too close to England's throne for Elizabeth I to ever feel safe. After being forced to abdicate and flee to England, Mary spent 19 years in custody, a royal guest who could easily become a rallying point for rebellion. When letters were found linking her to a Catholic plot to assassinate Elizabeth, the Queen signed her death warrant unwillingly, then claimed regret once it was too late. On February 8, 1587, Mary walked calmly to the block in a crimson underdress, the color of martyrdom. It took 3 swings of the axe to take her head. Her death ended 2 queens' rivalry, but ensured dynastic victory for Mary's bloodline. Her son, James VI of Scotland, would inherit both thrones. The execution meant to secure Elizabeth's legacy, instead passed the crown to Mary's child.
Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, The Fall of a Throne, 1793. By the winter of 1792, Paris had turned against its monarchy. Years of debt, famine, and royal excess collided with revolution. Louis XVI, once the most Christian king, stood accused of treason against his own people for inviting foreign armies to restore his power. In January 1793, he mounted the scaffold, calmly saying, "I die innocent of all the charges laid against me." The guillotine's blade fell before he could finish. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette followed him to the same fate. Once adored for her beauty, she was now mocked as Madame Deficit. The crowd cheered as her carriage rolled through streets, still echoing from her husband's execution. She said nothing but an apology to the executioner for stepping on his foot. Together, their deaths became the revolution's turning point. The guillotine promised equality, but with a king and a queen beneath its blade, it became the revolution's most terrifying symbol of justice and revenge.
William Kidd was never meant to be a pirate. A respected Scottish privateer, he was commissioned by English lords to attack enemy ships and protect trade routes. But in the confusing web of international politics, his legal captures were rebranded as piracy when alliances shifted.
Accused of murder and plunder, he became a scapegoat for the very men who'd funded him. At Execution Dock in London, thousands watched as he was hanged twice. The rope snapped on the first drop, and he was made to stand again on the scaffold and face his death a second time. His body was then bound in iron chains and left to rot over the Thames for 3 years, a warning to any future pirates. Kidd's story blurred the line between criminal and scapegoat. The government got its spectacle of justice. The crowd got its legend of the haunted pirate with treasure buried somewhere still undiscovered.
Giordano Bruno wasn't a warrior or a rebel. He was a scholar who believed the universe had countless worlds, and that truth shouldn't belong only to the church. In an age when heresy and astronomy were dangerous twins, his ideas were dynamite. The Inquisition arrested him in 1592, accusing him of blasphemy, magic, and spreading infinite cosmologies that dethroned Earth itself. For 8 years, he refused to recant. When judges read his death sentence, Bruno told them quietly, "You pronounce this sentence with greater fear than I receive it." On February 17, 1600, he was paraded naked through Rome's Campo de' Fiori, his tongue clamped to silence him. A wooden stake was lit beneath his feet. Witnesses say he never cried out. The church burned a heretic. History remembers a visionary who saw the cosmos too soon. 4 centuries later, a bronze statue of Bruno now stands on that spot, his eyes fixed toward the Vatican, unblinking. Jacques de Molay, the last Knight Templar, 1314. Once among Christendom's most powerful orders, the Knights Templar answered only to the Pope and their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. They were bankers, soldiers, and landlords of empires. That power tempted France's King Philip IV, who owed them a fortune. In 1307, he had every Templar in France arrested, charging them with heresy to erase his debt. After 7 years of torture and trial, de Molay was taken to the Ile de la Cité in Paris. He confessed, then retracted when he saw the truth of his fate. On March 18, 1314, he was chained to a stake and burned alive while proclaiming his order's innocence and cursing the king and pope. Within a year of his death, both men were dead themselves. That coincidence became legend, the Templar curse. Whether myth or justice, it turned an execution meant to erase a brotherhood into a story that still haunts European history.
François Ravaillac, the killer of a king, 1610. François Ravaillac was a fanatic caught between faith and madness. A former schoolteacher turned religious zealot, he was convinced that King Henry IV of France had betrayed Catholicism by making peace with Protestants. On May 14, 1610, as the royal carriage paused in a narrow Paris street, Ravaillac lunged through the window and stabbed the king twice. He was captured instantly and interrogated brutally for weeks, seeking a conspiracy that didn't exist. Condemned as a regicide, he was taken to the Place de Grève before a crowd of thousands. Executioners tore his flesh with red-hot pincers, poured molten lead into the wounds, and finally quartered him by horses. All that remained was ash. France learned 2 lessons that day: that a lone knife could shatter a kingdom, and that a state terrified of chaos will match violence with violence until nothing is left to rule.
Thomas Cromwell, the King's Axe Turns Back, 1540. Thomas Cromwell rose from the son of a blacksmith to become the most powerful man in England. As King Henry VIII's chief minister, he engineered the break with Rome, the downfall of monasteries, and the deaths of those who stood in the king's way, including Anne Boleyn. But power in Tudor England was borrowed, never owned. In 1540, Cromwell arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves to secure a German alliance. When the king found her unattractive and the union politically useless, Cromwell was blamed. Accused of treason and heresy, he was dragged from his desk to the Tower of London. On July 28, 1540, ironically the same day Henry married his new love, Catherine Howard, Cromwell was beheaded. It took several blows to finish. His fall showed the Tudor truth: serve a volatile king long enough, and you will either make his empire or feed his scaffold.
Tupac Amaru II, The Body of a Rebellion, 1781.
In the Andes, a descendant of Incan royalty named José Gabriel Condorcanqui took the name Tupac Amaru II and led a mass uprising against Spanish colonial rule. He preached an end to corvée labor and taxes, uniting thousands of natives and mestizos. For a moment, the Andes seemed ready to break their chains. Captured in 1781, he was forced to watch his family executed first. Then, on the main plaza of Cusco, authorities tied his arms and legs to 4 horses, ordered to pull in opposite directions. When his body refused to tear apart, they beheaded him instead. Spain called it justice, Peru called it martyrdom. Today his name is a banner for indigenous movements through Latin America, proof that even a body broken can still stand in memory.
Grigori Rasputin, the monk who would not die, 1916. Grigori Rasputin was a Siberian peasant turned mystic whose hold over Russia's imperial family was legendary. He seemed able to ease the pain of the Tsarevich Alexei's hemophilia, and for Tsarina Alexandra, that made him irreplaceable. To the nobility, he was a devil in a saint's robe, proof that the Romanovs had lost all sense of decency. On the night of December 30, 1916, a circle of aristocrats invited him to the Moika Palace and fed him cakes and wine laced with cyanide. When that failed, they shot him multiple times. He fell, rose again, and fled into the snow before being bludgeoned and dumped into the frozen Neva River. When his body was found, his lungs held water, suggesting he drowned. His death brought no peace. 5 weeks later, the February Revolution toppled the Romanovs entirely. A failed mystic and a botched murder became the final omen for a dying empire.